Welcome back, everyone. Ready for another deep dive?
Absolutely. Always excited to explore new ideas.
Well, today we're going deep into the world of Christian mysticism
Sounds intriguing. Where are we starting?
with a really fascinating text from 1901 called An Introduction to Christian Mysticism.
1901. Wow, going way back.
Right. But honestly, it's amazing how relevant these ideas still feel today. Though, I gotta admit, mysticism can seem a bit, well, mysterious.
Yeah, it definitely has that reputation. I mean, it's fascinating how something so focused on spiritual connection can sometimes get a bad rap. Mysticism is often viewed with a bit of suspicion, even by those who study it.
It's so true. Like, why does this pursuit of unity with God make some people nervous?
Well, it's probably because some of the practices associated with mysticism, like nihilism, mystery, visions, and trances, can be easily misunderstood. And they can even be dangerous if taken out of context.
Yeah, those do sound pretty intense. So, beneath the surface of those potentially intense practices, what's at the heart of this mystical pursuit?
At its core, mysticism is a journey toward experiencing union with the highest, with God.
Okay, so it's not just about rituals or doctrines.
Exactly. It's about a direct, personal encounter with the divine.
That reminds me of the definition from Mr. Inge, quoted a text. He describes mysticism as the attempt to realize, in thought and feeling, the immanence of the eternal in the temporal and the temporal in the eternal. It's like bridging the gap between the everyday and the divine.
Absolutely. And Christian mysticism in particular emphasizes the immediate personal feeling of oneness between yourself and God.
So there's an emotional component as well as an intellectual one.
Definitely. And the text outlines three distinct stages of this mystical journey: purification, illumination, and finally, union.
Union being the ultimate goal.
Precisely. Union is where the mystic strives to transcend earthly limitations and experience complete communion with the divine. It's the culmination of that intense personal journey.
Okay, so let's talk history for a moment. Where does Christian mysticism fit in the grand scheme of things?
Well, our author traces it back to Plato, calling him the father of European mysticism.
Interesting.
His ideas about the soul, the divine, and the path to spiritual enlightenment influenced centuries of philosophical and religious thought, including Christian mysticism. Think of it like a philosophical ripple effect reaching across time.
It's incredible how ideas travel through time.
Hmm.
Speaking of which, the text also mentions Philo, a Jewish philosopher who tried to reconcile Jewish thought with Greek philosophy, especially Platonism. It's a fascinating blend of ideas. What was his impact on Christian mysticism?
Philo played a crucial role by laying some of the groundwork. His attempts to reconcile the God of the Old Testament with the philosophical concepts of Plato paved the way for Christian thinkers who came later. It gave them a framework for exploring mystical ideas within their own faith.
So Philo was a bridge builder of sorts.
You could say that.
Then we have Origen, another key figure in early Christian mysticism. What makes him stand out?
What's interesting about Origen is that he acknowledged not all Christians reach the highest spiritual level. This idea that there are varying degrees of spiritual understanding within the faith is a key concept in mysticism. And honestly, it's a relief to hear.
Huh, I get that. Not everyone has to be a mystical master.
Exactly.
Okay, so we've talked about the goal of union with God, but I have to ask, are there any potential dangers or pitfalls on this mystical path? It all sounds pretty intense.
There are indeed. The source material actually warns against two particularly dangerous tendencies. One is this desire to completely escape the limitations of being human.
Like just check out of reality altogether.
It can lead to rejecting the physical world and fixating solely on spiritual pursuits, which can become unhealthy.
So don't go full hermit and forget about the world around you.
Exactly. The second tendency is the urge to enter the divine dark.
Divine dark. Okay, that sounds ominous.
Some people see this as a state of nothingness, which can sound a bit like, well, annihilation.
Yeah, that does sound a little scary. Is that what mystics are really after?
Not quite. The text clarifies that the divine dark isn't about the self being destroyed. It's more about abandoning the ego and selfish desires so you can achieve true communion with God. Think of it like shedding your limited self-centered perspective and embracing a much larger divine reality.
So it's less about erasing yourself and more about surrendering to something larger than yourself.
You got it. Now, another point the source raises is the danger of pantheism, the belief that God is everything and everything is God. It's a tempting idea, but can lead to an overly optimistic worldview that doesn't acknowledge the reality of sin and suffering in the world.
So it's about finding that balance, acknowledging both the good and the bad.
Precisely, and that's where understanding the nuances of Christian mysticism becomes even more crucial.
Well, with all these historical founders and complex ideas swirling around, it's hard to know where to even begin. How can we make sense of this vast cast of characters?
Don't worry, our author provides a helpful framework. She groups mystics into 3 categories: the saint, the sage, and the spiritualist. Each embodies a different way of approaching the divine.
Okay, I'm intrigued. Tell me more about these categories. What makes each one unique?
Well, the sage is the philosopher, the one who seeks intellectual understanding of the divine. Think of them as the deep thinkers. The saint, on the other hand, embodies spiritual devotion and lives a life of selfless service. They put their mystical understanding into action.
So they walk the walk, so to speak. What about the spiritualist?
The spiritualist is all about those more mystical, experiential aspects of the journey. Visions, trances, that direct communication with the divine.
It's fascinating how there's no one-size-fits-all approach to this. Okay, so let's dive into some of these prominent figures. The text starts with Plotinus. Didn't he have some intriguing ideas about the soul?
He did. Plotinus believed that the soul has 2 lives, so to speak. There's the animal life, which is concerned with earthly matters, and then there's the higher life, which originates from God and yearns to return to that divine source.
So it's like a part of us is always reaching for something beyond the material world.
Exactly. And then there's Epictetus, a Stoic philosopher whose ideas actually align surprisingly well with Christian mysticism, even though he wasn't a Christian himself.
What about Epictetus stood out to you?
His central message was all about aligning your will with the will of God. It's about letting go of control and trusting in a higher power. This idea of surrender is a common thread you see in a lot of mystical traditions, including Christianity.
Surrender. That's powerful.
Okay.
Next on the list is Dionysius. He seems a bit mysterious, right?
He is indeed. Some scholars even think he might have been a fraud who falsely attributed his writings to one of St. Paul's converts. Talk about a historical mystery.
Wow, a real cloak and dagger situation. And then there's Meister Eckhart, a Dominican mystic, who really emphasized the concept of union with God. What was his approach?
Eckhart's ideas are deep, to say the least. He talks about the ground of the soul and the divine spark within each of us as being one with God. It's the idea that even when we feel separate from the divine, there's a fundamental connection that's always there.
So even when we're lost, we're still found, in a way.
Exactly. And then there's Jacob Boehme, a German mystic, who used a really vivid analogy to describe the relationship between the divine and the material world. I love a good analogy.
Me too. Lay it on me.
Boehme described the world as being like an apple. The rind represents the material world, while the core represents the divine.
So the deeper you go, the closer you get to the heart of it all.
That's the idea. It's a powerful image that captures the essence of the mystical journey.
Now, the text also mentions Tauler. Didn't he have quite a dramatic story?
He did. Tauler had this intense conversion experience that led him down a path full of challenges and persecution. He actually endured a lot of suffering because of his mystical beliefs.
So for him, this wasn't just an intellectual pursuit. It was a total life transformation.
Absolutely. And in the end, his perseverance paid off. He triumphed over adversity and became a respected spiritual leader.
What a testament to his commitment. The text also mentions the author of Theologia Germanica. Anything interesting about that one?
This work is really all about self-surrender as the key to finding union with God. The author argued that the individual will has to essentially die in order to be reborn in the divine.
It sounds like a theme we've heard before, letting go of ego to embrace a higher purpose.
Right, and it's an idea that echoes throughout Christian mystical thought.
Next, there's Thomas à Kempis, the author of the famous Imitation of Christ. I actually think I've heard of that one.
It's a classic of Christian devotional literature, and it stresses the importance of humility as an essential quality for those seeking union with God. Not about power or recognition, but about simplicity and surrender.
A message we could all use a reminder of, probably. Now, the text briefly mentions 2 other mystics, Ruysbroek and Suso.
Yes, these 2 were known for having vivid visions and intense spiritual experiences. Ruysbroek, in particular, emphasized firm intention and conscious striving as being crucial in the pursuit of holiness.
So it's not just about passive contemplation. There's an element of action and effort involved.
Absolutely. Aligning your will with God's will and actively working towards spiritual growth. Intention is key.
Okay, and finally, we come to 2 incredibly influential figures, St. John of the Cross and St. Teresa, what made them stand out?
These two were forces to be reckoned with. They weren't just content with having personal mystical experiences. They felt driven to bring about positive change within the church. They weren't afraid to shake things up.
So they took their mystical insights and put them into action in the world.
Exactly. And their emphasis was on action. They believed that real mysticism isn't just about passive contemplation. It's about actively working to help others and reform religious orders to better reflect the true spirit of Christian faith.
It sounds like they took that idea of union with God and extended it to encompass service to others as well.
You could say that. Now, contrast that with Molinos and Madame Guyon, who represented a very different path within Christian mysticism. They were associated with quietism.
Quietism, what's that?
It was a mystical movement that emphasized passive surrender to God's will above all else. They thought any attempts at self-effort, even in prayer or good works, were distractions from true union with God.
So almost the opposite of St. John of the Cross and St. Teresa.
In many ways, yes. Quietism actually sparked a lot of controversy within the church. Some saw it as a dangerous form of passivity that ignored the importance of action and service.
Wow, so even within a single religious tradition, you have such diverse interpretations and expressions of mystical thought.
It really is amazing. It speaks to the complexity and richness of the human spiritual experience.
Okay, so we've explored this fascinating landscape of figures and ideas. It's incredible how many different ways there are to approach and experience Christian mysticism. But I have to wonder, given the challenges we face in the modern world, all the materialism, the divisiveness, the general disillusionment, does Christian mysticism have something unique to offer us today?
It's a great question, and I think the answer is a resounding yes. Christian mysticism, at its core, is all about transcending those limited, ego-driven ways of seeing the world. It's about tapping into a much deeper sense of interconnectedness and realizing the divine spark within ourselves and all beings.
So it's about moving beyond that us versus them mentality that's so prevalent these days.
Exactly. Christian mysticism invites us to see ourselves as part of this vast web of life, all emanating from the same divine source. And when you start seeing things that way, you naturally cultivate deeper compassion, empathy, and responsibility for the well-being of all creation.
It sounds like an antidote to the isolation and division that's plaguing our society right now.
It really is. And in a world that's so obsessed with external achievements and material possessions, Christian mysticism reminds us that true fulfillment comes from within, from nurturing that deep, abiding connection with the divine.
So it's about shifting our focus from those fleeting, superficial things to something much deeper and more meaningful.
Exactly. It's realizing that our true worth isn't determined by our bank accounts or how many likes we get on social media, but by our inherent connection to the divine, to the source of all love, wisdom, and compassion.
And in a time when so many people are struggling with anxiety and uncertainty, that kind of grounding can be incredibly powerful.
Absolutely. Christian mysticism offers us a path to inner peace and stability, even when the world around us feels chaotic. It teaches us to surrender our fears and anxieties to a higher power, to trust in the unfolding of God's plan, even when things feel dark and uncertain.
So it's not about pretending everything's perfect, but about finding that inner strength and resilience to face whatever comes our way.
Exactly. It's about cultivating an unshakable inner peace that comes from knowing that we're not alone in this journey, that we are held in the loving embrace of the divine, no matter what challenges life throws at us.
Okay, so we've talked about how relevant these ideas are, but how do we make Christian mysticism accessible and appealing to people today? How do we move beyond those stereotypes of cloistered monks and rituals to present it as a vibrant, living tradition that can enrich our lives right now?
It's a great question. It's vital that we find a way to translate these ancient teachings into a language that resonates with people today to meet them where they are.
So bridging the gap between the traditional language of mysticism and the everyday lives of people today.
Precisely. And one way to do that is by highlighting the connections to practices that are already popular, like mindfulness and meditation. Many of these techniques actually have their roots in these ancient contemplative traditions, including Christian mysticism.
I can see that. There's a growing interest in these practices, but maybe people aren't aware of the deeper spiritual dimension.
Right. It's about making those connections more explicit, showing how these practices can be a way to tap into this rich wellspring of Christian mystical wisdom.
And I think storytelling can play a huge role here as well. Instead of just focusing on abstract concepts, share the stories of the mystics themselves. their struggles, triumphs, and those aha moments that can make these teachings come alive.
Absolutely. People connect with stories. They want to hear about real individuals who've walked this path and experienced transformation.
So humanize the tradition, make it relatable.
Exactly. We need to reclaim the narrative of Christian mysticism. It's not just some dry academic thing. It's a vibrant, life-affirming path that can lead us to greater love, compassion, and wholeness.
I love that. So we've talked about cultivating stillness, learning from the mystics, exploring contemporary expressions of the tradition, and sharing those powerful stories. What else can we do to nurture this mystical impulse, both individually and within our communities?
One crucial aspect we haven't touched on yet is the importance of community. Throughout history, mystics have often come together in groups, whether they're formal monastic orders or just informal gatherings of like-minded seekers.
It's that sense of we're all in this together, finding your tribe.
Exactly. These communities provide a space to share experiences, offer support, and hold each other accountable on the path.
So recognizing that we don't have to go it alone.
Precisely. We need each other's support, encouragement, and wisdom to navigate the challenges and joys of this mystical path. And those communities can also become powerful forces for change in the world.
It's about channeling those individual transformations into collective action.
Absolutely. When people who've been touched by the mystical impulse come together, they can achieve incredible things. They can inspire each other to live out their values in concrete ways, working for justice, peace, and the well-being of all creation.
Wow. So it's about personal transformation, but it's also about something much bigger than ourselves.
That's the beauty of it. Christian mysticism calls us to be agents of change in the world, to create a world that reflects the love, compassion, and justice we've experienced in our own hearts.
That's an inspiring vision. So let's shift gears a little and talk about some practical tools and techniques. If someone's feeling inspired and wants to explore this further, where should they begin?
Well, one powerful practice that comes to mind is Lectio Divina.
Lectio Divina. That rings a bell, but can you refresh my memory?
It's a Latin term that means divine reading, and it's been a central practice in Christian monastic traditions for centuries.
Okay, so it's not your typical speed reading situation.
Not at all. Lectio Divina involves approaching Scripture with this posture of openness, really listening for those whispers of the divine within the words.
So it's about slowing down, savoring each phrase, letting the text really sink in.
Exactly. It's a four-step process.
Oh.
Lectio reading, meditation, oratio, prayer, and contemplatio, contemplation. You read a passage slowly, meditate on its meaning, allow it to inspire prayer, and then simply rest in a state of contemplation.
It sounds like a beautiful way to connect with those sacred texts on a deeper level.
It really is. And the beauty of it is that it's not about overanalyzing the text. It's about opening yourself to the transformative power of God's word, allowing it to work on your heart and mind.
Beautiful. And what about centering prayer? Is that another practice that might be helpful?
Absolutely. Centering prayer is a contemporary contemplative practice, but it draws inspiration from those ancient Christian mystical traditions.
So is it similar to meditation?
In some ways, yes. You set aside some time for silence and stillness, letting go of thoughts and focusing your attention on a sacred word or phrase.
Quieting the mental chatter to create space for the divine presence to emerge.
Precisely. And as you practice centering prayer consistently, you cultivate a deeper sense of inner peace, a stillness that begins to permeate even those busy moments of everyday life.
It sounds incredibly grounding. And earlier you mentioned the importance of community on this journey. Are there any resources for people who want to connect with others who are exploring these ideas?
There are tons of resources. If you're interested in contemplative practices like centering prayer, there are contemplative outreach groups all over the world.
So you can find local groups and practice together, support each other along the way.
Exactly. And for those who are drawn to more traditional forms of Christian mysticism, monasteries and retreat centers offer programs and workshops.
Spend a weekend or even a longer period immersed in that contemplative environment. I love that idea.
It's a powerful way to disconnect from the distractions of everyday life and really go deep with your practice.
Now, I'm sure some listeners might feel intimidated by all of this. It might seem a bit out there or too complicated. What would you say to those who are hesitant?
I would encourage them to approach it with a sense of curiosity and openness. You don't have to be a theologian or a monk to benefit from these practices.
Just take small steps, experiment, and see what works for you.
Exactly. Start with a few minutes of centering prayer each day, or try a simple Lectio Divina exercise with a passage from Scripture that resonates with you. See how it feels.
And remember, there's no one right way to do any of this. It's about finding what works for you on your unique journey.
Couldn't have said it better myself.
Well, this deep dive has been absolutely enlightening. We've explored the history of Christian mysticism, the challenges and rewards of the path, and some practical ways to bring these teachings into our lives.
It's been a pleasure sharing this exploration with you and our listeners.
And to wrap things up, I'd like to leave everyone with a quote from Meister Eckhart, one of the great Christian mystics. "The eye through which I see God is the same eye through which God sees me." May we all cultivate that eye of love, compassion, and understanding, not just for ourselves, but for every living being. And may our journeys of mystical exploration lead us to greater peace, wisdom, and wholeness.
Beautifully said. The journey doesn't end here. Keep seeking, keep exploring, and keep opening yourself to the mystery and wonder of the divine.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. Until next time, keep diving deeper.